I think we can safely say that, according and as a consequence of the Four Noble Truths that the Buddha explained, that Buddhism is actually a method, the Dharma is a method to attain the cessation of suffering. And that method, which comprises, of course, not just one method, but as again the teachings say, like 84,000 different teachings, different ways, which is actually sort of synonymous of infinity, different ways for that are supposed to suit every one of us. In order to be able to achieve some sort of transformation within ourselves that will allow the cessation of suffering to happen. And so the basic thing, I think, what the methods of Buddhism are trying to achieve or are supposed to achieve is this inner transformation within ourselves. But of course, we have to implement them and try them on and and own them in a way, so that we make them ours and we're sure that they're efficient. And sometimes I have found, and this I'm talking from my perspective, coming from a practitioner from the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, but probably it will also have some bearing in other traditions. And sometimes I think the cultural differences might be a slight obstacle, in the sense that when we're talking about teachings, unless we're talking about the absolute truth, if we're talking about arguments or ways of seeing things for developing bodhicitta or developing the enlightened mind or whatever, compassion and all of this, are always somehow based in cultural assumptions, and those sometimes are in a very subtle way, sometimes in a very obvious way, but also sometimes in a subtle way, are related to a culture, which means that for us Westerners, or for some of us who are Westerners, it is sometimes there is this need of decodification, of bringing these concepts or these ideas into our own way of feeling, in not necessarily transforming them or anything, but making them ours in order to have the exact same, not the exact same, but to have some sort of response in terms of developing, for instance, compassion within ourselves, that are meant to provoke when they were taught for the people to which they were taught. And sometimes this requires a little adaptation. And since I've been around in Buddhism for quite a long time, I have to say that the Tibetan teachers in the beginning that I met in the 70s, late 70s, 80s, some of them were really not acquainted with Western culture at all. And most of them didn't even speak English. They just spoke Tibetan. And so sometimes they just thought like they would be teaching to Tibetans, and that required from us. I was fortunately very, very young, so there was a lot of room to be flexible and adjust and adapt and understand what they were meaning, because I wasn't too fixed in a certain view of things yet. But this requires from us sometimes a little adjustment. Now, fortunately, nowadays, since several decades past, the teachers that are now teaching Tibetan, I'm talking, of course, or Westerners, but I'm not talking about the other traditions because I don't know them so well, Zen or Theravada or all of those. Now they're much more acquainted with the Western culture, and also they speak English, which makes things much easier. But anyway, going back to what I was just saying about this transformation that needs to occur in ourselves in order for the cessation of suffering to be able for us to be able to accomplish this cessation of suffering. There is this transformation that needs to happen, and I recently was listening to a teaching, and it was Ringo Tuko, and he was explaining that whenever we have whatever emotional response, whether positive or negative, it also comes about because of three things, or there are three levels for some reaction. Let's say now a negative reaction, because those are the ones we need to get rid of in order to achieve some happiness, some well-being, and some positive attitude. So there are three things. And at the basic level, like basic, when I say basic is the deepest level, we have the deep-seated ignorance, or then from which come all this attachment, aversion, and all of these negative traits, pride and envy, and all the 5 poisons, as it is stated in Buddhist teachings. And those are very subtle, and sometimes they become very obvious, but we're talking here about habitual tendencies that are deep-seated within ourselves and a little bit like out of reach. And this is in the long term. This is what we are supposed to uproot. And uproot is a good term because it really means that they're deep, deep within the earth, deep within ourselves, and we really need to go deep to sort of extract them. And of course, this will take a lot of time. It's not something that we can accomplish in a day or two, maybe if we're very lucky and we have a sudden enlightenment. But otherwise, it's something that takes time. It's not something that, because it's even difficult for us to recognize those emotions, and then much less to uproot them completely. Then, but that in itself, it's not enough to create a reaction, because those things are always there, but we are not always angry, we are not always desiring something, we are not always puffed up with pride or anything. So these tendencies are there, but they're not necessarily active or expressing themselves unless something triggers them. And then, of course, something pops up, a more tangible reaction, whether it's physical, mental, verbal, or all of them together. So that means some can be an inner trigger, some sort of mood or something that sometimes we cannot really put why am I feeling like this? It's not always obvious, but more often is something external, something somebody said, something we saw in the news, something we read somewhere, something anywhere. So that's why we often have the impression that it's because of others that we are unhappy, or it's so easy for us to put the fault into other people or circumstances or things like this, because they're actually the trigger. So it is easy to mistake them for the real reason. They're not the reason why we are having this emotion or this reaction or this suffering. They're just the trigger. The real reason is within, much deeply installed. But still, with these two things happening or coming together, it's still not enough. And there's the need for a third factor. And that third factor is a specific way of looking at that trigger. And if we're talking about a negative reaction, we might say a negative way to look at that trigger. Because as Buddhist practitioners, I'm sure we all have noticed that sometimes the same thing, or more or less the same thing, the same sentence or the same words or the same meaning or something similar might happen to different people, for instance, and they won't necessarily react in the same way. And even to ourselves, depending on how our day is going or on any moment of our life, you're more happy or more unhappy or more dissatisfied or whatever, we might have a different reaction. And sometimes a completely different reaction. Also, sometimes just it can be separate in time, but it can be almost very quickly. There can be a change very quickly if we just look at whatever is happening in a slight different way. So that's something that is very important. And when we look at these three things, we realize also that most people, I mean, what I sometimes think, what really makes the difference between a spiritual person and a non-spiritual person is that non-spiritual people who don't have this perspective, is not that we are better or worse, it's not the thing, but if you don't have a spiritual perspective, what will happen is that we only blame others or other circumstances. And we only try also to control them and make sure that unpleasant things don't happen because we blame those things for the feelings that we have. The difference now when we have this more spiritual perspective is that we understand that the external circumstances and people are not the only reason why we feel the way we feel. And more important than those things is our own way of reacting to whatever happens. And then, of course, if we go even deeper and go deeper into Buddhist teachings, we understand that even this last piece, the more the perspective we have about things, it's still on a more superficial level because deep down we need to also, in the long term, in the long run, uproot the negative, the deepest negative perspective, or wrong not in the sense of right and wrong, but wrong in the sense that it is twisted. It's not the reality. We're not seeing things as they are. And because of that, and because that is happening since such a long time, it has become an habitual tendency to see the world from this duality point of view, and that's what samsara is. So what can we do? What can we do? What is the training about? The training is about acting. It doesn't mean that we cannot do anything to control or to try to create good circumstances, outer circumstances, but we don't focus only on that. We have to realize that our training consists in the first level, or sort of emergency level, consists in trying to become more aware of the way we look at things, how our perspective about things, and try to change it in case it is negative, and get used and habituate ourselves to a more realistic, I would say, not necessarily positive, because sometimes when we talk about positive, we might think it's something like a false, that we are looking at things that are really negative, and then we sort of force ourselves to see them as positive in a sort of almost artificial way, but that's not what we're supposed to do, or that might not work, I would say. But just try to see them in a more realistic and perhaps less dramatic way for a start, and so training ourselves in that. And of course, we all know, and this is, it's the traditional way of describing the Buddhist path in three ways. There are many ways to describe or to the Buddhist path, but one of them is to talk about ethics, and then meditation, and then wisdom. And when we think about this, we see that ethics and meditation are supposed to, and wisdom are supposed to really tackle the two levels that need to be tackled. The level where, and that's more the wisdom, the level where the deep-seated habitual tendencies, and then ethics and meditation. Ethics, it's more about how to react or have a more positive outlook, and then meditation actually serves both. It's as a way to become more aware, calm our mind, and then train ourselves into a certain view of things. And then if we go even deeper in meditation, experience the way things are, and in that sense slowly uprooting the deepest ignorance and attachment and all of that. So now if we think about how to implement this, what I have found is, again, going back to the traditional way of presenting this, we think that it's often spoken about the way to learn and practice the Dharma goes through 3 steps, like listening, reflecting, and meditating. And I have found recently, I thought about this, because listening, well, that's listening at the time, because many people didn't know how to read. So nowadays it can be listen, yes, there's lots of teachings that we can attend to. Nowadays, even on YouTube or things like this, we can read also, of course, books. But then the most important thing, maybe, I mean, after that, after having listened and reading and all of that, we need to reflect. And reflect, I'm talking about myself. When I have listened this several times, I mean many times, of course, in teachings and listening, reflecting and meditating, and I've always felt like reflecting was kind of, how can I say, I didn't even see much of the point of talking about reflecting, because if you listen and you meditate, reflecting sort of comes automatically while you read, I would say. But then recently I thought of my own experience, and I realized that actually teaching has, as we often say, teaching is the best way to learn, and it's so true. Because teaching Dharma now for some time, I have learned so much more in this time while teaching. Not more, I have deepened my understanding of the Dharma so much more because of because of teaching. And that made me think that actually, in order to teach, you really have to reflect. Because when we absorb these teachings, whether reading or listening to somebody explaining, and first of all, we tend to be a little distracted, because that's how our mind works like that. we listen a piece and then some thought comes and we go after it and then we come back, so we miss the piece. And that's why when we listen again, say, oh, I don't remember listening to this, because yes, we weren't there at that time. But then not only that, but it is sort of, it stays in the more superficial level. So what they mean by reflecting is really going deeper. And I realized that teaching is an excellent way to reflect on these teachings. Of course, I'm not saying everybody should go about and knock at everyone at the neighbor's door and try to teach them so that we can reflect on that. But sometimes it would be perhaps helpful if we just try to put into our own words, even writing something or, something like that about, what is, I don't know, karma, for instance, or things like that. And that is a good way. Well, when you're in school, we have homework, and homework exactly is exercising into, replying to questions and things like this, about what we heard in the classroom or what the teacher has taught. So maybe something in that line would be helpful in order for us to really deeply reflect into these things. Try to have even an intellectual understanding. But the good thing about Buddhism is that then we have meditation. And meditation, again, is not just necessarily sitting quietly or silently. Meditation is, in this sense, is also how to train into experiencing these teachings, into make them our own, into letting them sink within ourselves. And that is achieved by repetition. That's exactly how we learn anything. We learn how to write, to read, to drive, and all of the other things that we learn in a new language, things like this. We learn by repetition, and that's exactly what we're supposed to do, and that's why we have to repeat again and again the practices from our tradition, whether it is meditation, whether it is prayer, whether it is whatever it is. It's something that we have to repeat, and this repetition is what will bring this attitude or this feeling or this positive emotion or whatever we're trying to, whether it's compassion or joy or whatever we're trying to achieve. The repetition will make it sink within ourselves, and sink actually even in the sense that it will go from just the frontal lobes of when we are very aware to the more automatic response, that reaching to the deepest layers of our mind, from where these clashes that strike whenever they are triggered. So I think so. This is. I think this seems perhaps a small thing, but in my case, and I'm just talking and sharing with you from my experience, I think this reflection on the Dharma is really important, and sometimes we fail to do it enough, I would say, and the proof I have it myself is that even after 20 years of Dharma or something, I still can see how much I have improved in the understanding and the in the, maybe to a certain extent, realization of the Dharma by reflecting on it, and with the motivation of teaching, of course, but the important part is the reflection. Then again, in terms of practice, I think unless we have a teacher and someone who really follows us in a very close way, like telling us exactly what kind of practice we should do and how to do it and all of that. So in that case, it's easy. But if we are a little bit on our own, which sometimes happens, we have teachers, of course, we have a follow a specific tradition, but it's not like the teacher will tell you exactly what you should do or what kind of practice. We often have, at least in the Tibetan tradition, I don't know about others, but in the Tibetan traditions, even if we follow just one teacher, which is not necessarily the case, we probably have several practices that we can do. And I think it's very important for us to then try to understand what's the point of all of that. For instance, in the Tibetan tradition, sometimes we are confronted with the recitation of mantras and the accumulation of numbers. I don't know if you're familiar with that. And I find that sometimes we get so overwhelmed with that part that we forget the reason why we are doing all of that, which is, of course, to trigger in ourselves certain ways of seeing things, some certain more positive perspectives on things, habituating our mind to a positive frame of mind, to a positive energy. So if we're just repeating something for the sake of some tradition or just to sort of perform something, a ritual or something like that, we might lose the essential part of the meaning and of how it should make us feel. And it's not about feeling good or feeling bad. It's not a new age thing. What I mean to say here is how it should make us feel in order to habituate our mind to feel in a positive way, to have a positive perspective. And we can see that with very well-trained practitioners. Again, I'm talking about my own tradition because that's what I know. But when we see a very well-trained practitioner and we see him or her dealing with any circumstance in life, anything that could be considered as a negative or challenging situation, he immediately, automatically and without any effort, will come up with a positive outlook for that. And that's the sign that that person has trained himself or herself long enough by repeatedly triggering or generating within himself or herself certain feelings, certain ways, certain frame of mind or energy that makes that makes things so easy. One example of this that I read recently in a book by Dzongsa Khyentse Rinpoche. I don't know if you're familiar with that book. It's called Living is Dying, and it's he brought together some of his teachings about life and advices about how to approach death, and he made it in a very broad way that can be useful for Buddhists and non-Buddhists alike, and even within Buddhist traditions. He also made it so that the different traditions within Buddhism can also find. It's not specifically meant for Tibetan Buddhists. That's what I mean. But there was a place. I'm not sure I saw it in the book itself or in a Facebook post, but it was said to come as a quote coming from that book. And the question was, somebody saying that if I know that I'm going to die and it's now a certainty and I have too much pain, can I abbreviate my life or something like that? And the reply was, if we are in that situation, and if you really know for sure, nobody ever can be sure of that, but if you know with pretty much certainty that there's nothing else and you're really close to death and you really wish to abbreviate your suffering, you can wish that all the years or months or weeks that you wish to die, you don't kill yourself, but you wish to die, and you wish that all the remaining like days or weeks or months that you should have to live could be sort of offered to the bodhisattvas who are performing, who are helping all beings, so that it can lengthen their lives, that are so useful to everyone. And when I read this, maybe I'm not expressing myself in a beautiful way, but when it was really beautifully said, and when I heard that, when I read that, there was an immediate shift within me, because it's something so inspiring, so positive, so beautiful, that it is there's a complete change, Somebody who is desperate and really wishes to abbreviate his or her life and comes up with such a beautiful idea. It is not necessarily that it will work, but it's such a beautiful idea. I don't know if we can really credit hours of life into somebody else's life account, but it's a beautiful idea and it's a beautiful wish, and it's something that transforms instantaneously. Something that could be a little negative, we could see it as a negative, not immoral, it's not what I mean, but negative in the sense something a little heavy or painful, into something really beautiful and luminous. And this for me was the example. Only somebody whose mind is perfectly trained into this, this seeing things in a positive way, by all the methods that we abundantly have in Buddhism, only somebody whose mind is perfectly trained can come up with such an incredible, simple, but incredibly powerful idea that can transform instantaneously things in our perspective. And that is what we should aim for. Training is about that. Training into the third of the three things, our changing our perspective, or making it positive, making it luminous, making it light, so that whenever we are confronted with anything in life, any circumstance, we can look at it from this with the habitual frame of mind that we have cultivated, and it's always possible. It doesn't matter how old we are, what's our starting point, if we have practiced a lot, if we haven't practiced at all, whatever, because it is a work in progress. It's not something in it I can say, now I've arrived and that's it, all is done. But we can still train every day, and that's why, and now I come to my point, is that's why all these techniques, we might call it techniques, but all these prayers, for instance, or things, we don't necessarily pray for somebody to give us something. We pray to train ourselves in certain attitudes, in certain frames of mind, to make them ours, to make them habitual, to get used to thinking that way, so that it becomes our second nature, or we should say our first nature. so that they become really part of ourselves in wherever we are and whatever we're doing, and without any thought, or without having to think about it. Of course, in the beginning we will have to think about it, but then as it goes, and more, by the repetition, in the exact same way as we got used to maybe negative things in the past, in the same way, by repetition, but repetition, not mechanical repetition. It is supposed to create some sort of feeling. We are supposed to experience something while we do these things, while we do these practices. By repetition, we slowly get into this making them ours and transforming into that. It becomes our way of being instead of some sort of exercise external to ourselves. That's again why it is so important that whatever practices we do, from whichever tradition they belong, they really mingle. We really make them ours. They're heartfelt and not just something we have to do. It's more something we experience. Actually, practicing is more like experiencing, not so much about doing. Even I think the expression to do meditation or something like this is not really correct in a sense, because it's not something we do. Of course, we use it and it's perfectly okay. But what I mean to say is, it's not so much about doing anything, like I've done 20 minutes of meditation, and we feel like we have accomplished something. But there's nobody measuring it. It's just how much it really transforms us. And that's the most important part, not so much how many hours or how many years or, because that won't say anything about how much we have been transformed by that. I can tell you, I've done a 3 years retreat in the 80s, so some time ago. And of course, it's hard to say that there was no transformation, but I can tell you that it is possible to come out of a long retreat like that, and maybe if we have been distracted, it's possible to still have a lot of things that didn't really change, because it's not about the amount of time we spend doing meditation. It's about how much of that time we were not actually doing meditation, but experiencing, letting ourselves. Meditation is the time that we can have to experience the teachings, and that is the most important thing we can do, because this is what actually transforms us, not the formality, but the experience. So I would say, and that's what I have been doing myself after some years of formal meditation and following certain practices and things like this. Nowadays I feel like, as I said, if you have a teacher and that teacher gives you a very specific practice, then of course this is not for you. But in my case, what I have found is that we have to find the practice that is most effective. And I'm not saying the one that is easier, because if it's very, very easy, maybe it is not, maybe we need something more challenging. But we have to find the one that is more effective, with which we feel like there is actually a transformation, there is actually something happening within ourselves, because it resonates, because it really makes us feel in a certain way, and not being so much into formality. That's how I feel, not being so much into the formality even of the words. If, for instance, there are some prayers or things like this, which again, as I said in the beginning, sometimes we have this obstacle of culture and also translations. Because as a Tibetan Buddhist, for instance, I understand a little bit of Tibetan, especially the prayers, but not enough to be able to feel what I'm saying. I understand some words, most of them in the prayers, especially if it's some prayer that I do every day. I understand enough, but not enough to actually feel what I'm saying through the Tibetan. So then we most of the times have to go through translations, and translations, when you're faced with, when you're a translator, and you have to choose whether you stick to the meaning literally, or you make it sound nice and be inspiring. And sometimes it's a very sort of dramatic choice. I can tell you, because I translated also I also translate sometimes, and it's very difficult because each language is different, and not only the language is different, the words also don't sort of resound in the same way within ourselves. In English, in French, in Portuguese, in Tibetan, in whatever Thai, whatever language it is. So there's also this need for us to be able to sort of not stick necessarily with the words or with the meaning of the words, but try to make them ours, like we are actually saying it ourselves, understanding the deep meaning. And sometimes it's better even to stick with one practice for some time. I'm not saying for all of our lives, but for some time stick with one practice, maybe just even a very simple one, but then go deeper. And, go deep and deep and deeper every day, in the sense of really evoking these feelings within ourselves, because that's what is going to transform us, not just reciting the words. And well, this is my experience, of course. It's absolutely, I don't pretend that this will be good or valid or helpful for everyone, but I have to say this is what I came about to at this stage of my life, and after some years of practice, I have found that it is the important thing is not what we perform, especially in a formal way, but it's more how we bring about certain feelings and certain experiences, and the training in that. That is the most important thing, because that is what ultimately really transforms us. It's the experience, not necessarily the knowledge, not necessarily the rituals, but the experience, the repeated experience of certain positive emotions, like compassion or joy or equanimity or many others,